In September of 2016, 21-year-old Rachel Sullivan disappeared without a trace on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. For 6 years, she was presumed dead, the victim of a fatal fall into the Potomac River gorge. But in March of 2022, she walked into a veterinary clinic in Frederick, Maryland, alive but unrecognizable. What she told investigators when she could finally speak shocked even the most experienced detectives. Where she was for those 6 years and what happened to her, you will find out in this story. Enjoy. Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. Before we dive into today's vanished story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. On September 14, 2016, a Wednesday morning, the first hints of autumn colored the leaves along the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct scent of dried leaves and mountain soil. But for 21-year-old Rachel Sullivan, this morning was the beginning of a journey that was supposed to last only a few hours, but stretched into years of silence. According to her roommate's statement to park rangers, Rachel was a graduate student at Northeastern University studying environmental science. Her thesis focused on documenting bird migration patterns along the Appalachian corridor. That Wednesday, her plan was simple. Hike a 12-mile loop on the Loudoun Heights Trail, photograph migrating raptors near the Potomac River overlooks, and return by sunset. At 7:15 in the morning, a trail camera captured Rachel entering the trailhead. She wore a dark green fleece jacket, cargo pants, and carried a bright orange backpack. In the footage, she paused to check her GPS device, adjusted her professional Nikon camera, and disappeared up the wooded path with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Her backpack contained everything a responsible day hiker would carry: 3 liters of water, energy bars, a first aid kit, rain gear, and her camera equipment worth over $3,000. The Loudoun Heights section climbs steeply from the Potomac River to rocky overlooks nearly 1,200 feet above the water. The path is narrow, with sections running close to vertical drops. For an experienced hiker like Rachel, it was challenging but manageable. At 11:47 in the morning, Rachel sent a text to her roommate. "Got an incredible shot of a red-tailed hawk. Signal is terrible up here. See you tonight." Her roommate replied immediately, but that message never reached Rachel's phone. It sat undelivered as Rachel's device lost connection to the cell tower. By 7:30 that evening, as darkness settled over the forest, Rachel had not returned to the parking area where her silver Honda sat alone. By 9:15, her roommate called the park ranger station, voice shaking. The ranger on duty took down the information but explained that night searches on the Appalachian Trail were too dangerous. Rescue would begin at first light. The search operation launched at 5:45 the next morning. Over 40 volunteers gathered at the trailhead, joined by park rangers, K-9 units, and a Virginia State Police helicopter with thermal imaging technology. The search coordinator divided teams into grid sections, moving slowly through the wilderness, calling Rachel's name every few minutes. The K-9 units were given Rachel's sweatshirt from her car to establish her scent. But within the first hour, both handlers reported the same problem. The scent trail was broken, inconsistent, as if Rachel had vanished into thin air. Overhead, the helicopter's thermal camera scanned every ravine and thicket, detecting only deer and a black bear. No human heat signature. By midday, the search covered over 8 square miles. Volunteers linked arms in human chains, combing through dense brush. They checked every hazard zone where someone could have slipped or fallen. They found nothing. No torn fabric, no disturbed soil, no blood, no signs of struggle. The working theory quickly became clear. Rachel had fallen from one of the cliff overlooks. The breakthrough came on the 4th day. A search team working the base of the gorge, a quarter-mile downstream from a dangerous overlook called Raven's Point, found something wedged between 2 boulders at the river's edge. A hiking boot, women's size 7. Salomon brand with distinctive red laces. Rachel's roommate identified it instantly. She remembered those red laces because Rachel had just replaced them the week before. The boot was waterlogged, covered in river silt, and inside was a handwritten label. Aris, 2016. Rachel's initials. Forensic teams examined the area. The boot's position suggested it had been carried by the current and deposited during high water flow. Dive teams were called in despite the danger. For 3 days, professional divers worked in shifts, descending into the murky, fast-moving water. They found debris, old tires, even deer remains. But no human body, no backpack, nothing else belonging to Rachel. On September 23rd, 9 days after her disappearance, the search coordinator held a press conference. Rachel's parents sat behind him, faces hollow with grief. The operation was being scaled back to a recovery mission. The official theory: Rachel had fallen from Raven's Point. The 300-foot drop would have been fatal. Her body had been swept away by the river, possibly trapped beneath debris miles downstream. Rachel's case was transferred to cold cases. Her name was added to the list of hikers who entered the wilderness and never returned. Her parents held a memorial service that November with no body to bury. They placed a small plaque near the trailhead. Rachel Sullivan, environmental scientist, forever part of these mountains. For 6 years, the world believed Rachel Sullivan was dead, her body lost in the Potomac River. No one imagined she was alive, close by, living through something worse than death. 6 years passed. March of 2022 brought an early thaw to Frederick, Maryland, a small city 30 miles from Harper's Ferry. Frederick was the kind of place where nothing shocking ever seemed to happen. That was about to change. On March 8th, a Tuesday afternoon, the security camera at Frederick Animal Care Clinic captured something disturbing. The timestamp read 3:17 p.m. A figure appeared at the clinic's front entrance, moving slowly, shuffling, as if each step required conscious effort. The woman was painfully thin. Her clothes, an oversized gray men's jacket and stained cargo pants, hung off her frame. On her feet were canvas sneakers with holes in the toes. Her long, tangled hair hung past her shoulders, partially hiding her face. But it was her posture that was most unsettling. Head down, eyes locked on the ground, shoulders hunched in complete submission. She paused at the door, not reaching for the handle immediately, as if waiting for permission. Inside, the receptionist Linda Porter glanced up as the door opened. The woman entered like a shadow, pressing herself against the wall, hands clasped, head still down. The smell hit Linda immediately. Unwashed clothes, chemicals, and something organic she couldn't identify. It reminded her of a neglected barn. "Can I help you?" Linda asked gently. The woman flinched as if expecting something painful. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and cracking. "Phone, please. I need a phone." Linda noticed the woman's hands shaking violently, not from cold but from something deeper. "Of course. Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman's eyes, when she lifted them, were glassy and filled with animal terror. "Just the phone. Please. I have to call. They said I could if there was an emergency." Linda reached for the desk phone, but the woman's legs buckled. No cry, no dramatic fall. She simply collapsed onto the clinic floor. Linda screamed for help and dialed 911. Paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. When they loaded the unconscious woman onto the stretcher, one EMT radioed ahead to Frederick Memorial Hospital. Female, approximately mid-20s, severe malnutrition, possible abuse victim. Scars all over her arms and old burn marks. Someone did this to her. At the hospital, the ER team cut away the filthy clothes. What they found shocked even experienced nurses. The woman weighed 94 pounds. Her ribs protruded through thin skin. Her arms and legs were covered with scars, some old, some recent. On her wrists and ankles were distinctive ring-shaped marks, pale and rough, the kind only prolonged restraint could cause. Her fingertips were covered with chemical burns and deep cracks, as if she'd worked with harsh cleaners for years without protection. When she regained consciousness 40 minutes later, she thrashed on the bed, trying to pull out 4 lines, eyes wild. A nurse tried to calm her, but the woman screamed, "I have to go back. They'll be angry. I didn't finish." She fought so hard the doctor had to sedate her. As she slowly calmed, still muttering, the physician made a decision. This wasn't just medical. This was criminal. He called the Frederick Police Department. Detective James Holloway had been with Frederick PD for 9 years. He'd worked domestic violence cases, drug-related assaults, even a homicide. But when he walked into that hospital examination room on the evening of March 8th and saw the woman curled on the bed, wrapped in a thin blanket and staring at absolutely nothing, he knew immediately this case was different from anything he'd ever encountered. She refused to give her name, refused to make eye contact. When Holloway pulled up a chair and tried asking the gentlest questions he could think of, "Where are you from? What's your name? Who hurt you?" she either responded with complete silence or the same desperate, broken plea delivered in a whisper. "Please let me go back. They need me. I have to finish my work." The hospital psychologist who'd been observing through the door pulled Holloway aside after the first failed attempt at communication. His assessment, hastily scribbled in his notes, would later become a key piece of evidence. Patient exhibits severe trauma response consistent with prolonged captivity. Possible Stockholm Syndrome. Learned helplessness so profound she appears to have lost any sense of autonomous identity or self-preservation instinct. She is not afraid of us. She is afraid of failing someone who is not here. With no identification, no cooperation, and clear physical evidence of long-term abuse, Detective Holloway made the decision to fingerprint her. It was standard procedure for unidentified individuals in potential criminal situations, and at this point it might be the only way to figure out who she was and where she'd come from. The portable fingerprint scanner was brought to her bedside. The woman didn't resist, but she also didn't help. Her hands simply lay limp and unresponsive as the officer gently lifted each finger and pressed it against the smooth glass surface of the scanner. Her fingertips were rough, covered with thick calluses and deep cracks that made getting clean prints difficult. The officer had to make multiple attempts on several fingers. The entire process took nearly 5 minutes. Then, the data was uploaded to the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, the FBI's massive national database containing prints from millions of people, missing persons, unidentified remains, and criminal records. Detective Holloway expected a quick match. Maybe someone with a minor record, petty theft, or drug possession. Maybe someone who'd been reported missing recently from a nearby state. What he didn't expect was the alert that appeared on his phone exactly 18 minutes later. An alert that made him stop mid-sentence in his conversation with a nurse and stare at the screen in disbelief. Match found. Missing person case. Status. Presumed deceased. Case closed. He opened the full file with hands that had started to shake slightly. The fingerprints were a 100% match to Rachel Elizabeth Sullivan. Date of birth, June 3, 1995. Last known location, Appalachian Trail, Loudoun Heights section, Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Date of disappearance, September 14, 2016. Case status, closed on October 1, 2016. Presumed cause, accidental death by fall from cliff, body swept away by river current. Detective Holloway looked from his phone screen to the woman on the hospital bed. The photo in the missing person file showed a vibrant, healthy 21-year-old with bright eyes, a confident smile, and the kind of energy that practically radiated from the image. The person lying 3 feet away from him was almost unrecognizable. Her face was gaunt, aged far beyond her actual 27 years. Her eyes were dull and lifeless. Her body was so emaciated that every bone was visible through her paper-thin skin. But fingerprints don't lie. They're one of the few pieces of evidence in law enforcement that approach absolute certainty. This was Rachel Sullivan, and she'd been missing for exactly 2,002 days. Within 40 minutes, the case had been escalated to the Maryland State Police Major Crimes Unit. By 7 o'clock that evening, a full investigative team had assembled at the hospital. Detectives from both Maryland and West Virginia jurisdictions, FBI agents who specialized in kidnapping and human trafficking cases, a forensic psychologist with specific experience in long-term captivity situations, and a victim advocate trained in trauma-informed communication. At 8:30 that night, Detective Holloway made the phone call that would change the Sullivan family's world for the second time in 6 years. Rachel's mother answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Detective James Holloway with the Frederick Police Department in Maryland. I need you to sit down. We found your daughter. Rachel is alive." The sound that came through the phone was something between a scream and a sob, a release of 6 years of unbearable grief compressed into a single moment of impossible hope. Her father grabbed the phone from her shaking hands, demanding to know if this was real, if this was some kind of cruel mistake. Detective Holloway, his own voice thick with emotion, assured them it was real. The fingerprints matched. Their daughter was alive. The Sullivans were on the road within 20 minutes, driving through the night from Boston to Frederick, a trip that normally takes 7 hours but which they completed in just over 5, speeding through darkness with a police escort that met them at the Maryland state line. But when they arrived at Frederick Memorial Hospital the next morning, March 9th, the hope that had carried them through the night ran headlong into a horrifying reality. The hospital staff had tried to prepare them. The psychologist had tried to explain what they were about to see. But nothing could truly prepare parents for what their daughter had become. Rachel didn't run into her mother's arms. She didn't cry with joy or relief. When her parents entered the room, their faces wet with tears, arms outstretched, Rachel's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She pressed herself against the far wall of the room, eyes going wide with terror, and began apologizing in a rapid, frantic whisper that grew louder and more panicked with each word. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to leave. I was told I could go. They said it was okay this time. Please don't tell them I talked to you. Please don't tell them I said anything. I'll go back right now. I'll finish everything. Please." Her mother tried to move closer, reaching out with trembling hands, but Rachel only pressed harder against the wall, making herself as small as possible, covering her head with her arms as if expecting a blow. The nurses had to gently pull Mrs. Sullivan back as she broke down completely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. The reunion that should have been the joyful end of a nightmare was instead a stark, devastating revelation. Rachel Sullivan had survived physically, but the person she had been was gone, replaced by someone who no longer understood that love wasn't a threat, that freedom wasn't a trap, that her family wasn't the enemy. It took another full day before Rachel was stable enough, both physically and mentally, for investigators to begin the careful, painstaking process of trying to understand where she had been and what had been done to her. A team of specialists worked in shifts, never pushing too hard, always watching for signs of re-traumatization, slowly building trust with a woman who had learned over 6 years that trust was the most dangerous thing in the world. Rachel's ability to communicate coherently was severely limited. She spoke in fragments, disjointed pieces of memory that came in flashes rather than coherent narratives. The words tumbled out in no particular order, mixed with long silences and moments where she seemed to disappear entirely into her own mind, eyes going blank and unfocused. She spoke of the place below, describing it as a dark room with no windows where she could never tell if it was day or night, where time stopped having any meaning at all. She mentioned the tasks. Endless cleaning and work that had to be done perfectly or there would be consequences she couldn't bring herself to describe. She talked about them in the plural, a man and a woman, though she never, not once, used their actual names. It was always he and she and they, as if speaking their names would somehow summon them back. Most chillingly, she kept repeating a phrase that made every investigator in the room feel sick. I wasn't allowed to remember before. When pressed gently on what that meant, Rachel explained in a flat, emotionless voice that thinking about her past, about who she used to be, about her family or her life or her dreams, was forbidden. When she did remember, when she couldn't stop the memories from coming, there were punishments. So she'd learned over time to stop remembering at all, to become someone with no past, no identity, no existence beyond the tasks and the rules and the endless present moment of captivity. While the psychological team worked carefully with Rachel, the investigative team launched a parallel effort to answer the question that haunted everyone involved. Where had she been for 6 years? And who had done this to her? The breakthrough came not from Rachel's fragmented testimony, but from physical forensic evidence. The clothes Rachel had been wearing when she collapsed at the veterinary clinic had been bagged and tagged as evidence. On the evening of March 9th, a forensic technician conducting a detailed examination of those clothes made a discovery that would crack the case wide open. In the front pocket of Rachel's filthy cargo pants, folded multiple times and compressed into a tight square, was a small piece of paper. When carefully unfolded and laid flat under laboratory lights, it revealed a handwritten shopping list. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, the letters formed with obvious difficulty, some tilting dramatically to one side, others pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. The list read, bleach 3 gallons, ammonia 2 bottles, steel wool rough kind, gloves large, livestock dewormer sheep kind, iodine big bottle. At the bottom of the list, in the same trembling handwriting, was a final line that sent chills through everyone who read it. Back before dark. Don't forget anything. Forensic document examiners were brought in to analyze the handwriting. Their report confirmed that the writing was consistent with Rachel Sullivan's known handwriting samples from before her disappearance, specifically from her class notes and research journals that her university had provided. However, the letter formation showed clear signs of being written under extreme stress or physical duress. The graphologist's report noted, the writer was experiencing significant hand tremors, possibly from exhaustion, malnutrition, or fear. The uneven pressure and wavering baseline suggest the note was written while in a state of high anxiety. But it was the paper itself, not just what was written on it, that provided the crucial investigative lead. The shopping list had been written on a piece of paper that had clearly been torn from something larger. The edges were rough and uneven. And when forensic specialists examined the reverse side of the paper under high-intensity lighting and spectral analysis, they found something that had been nearly worn away but was still faintly visible. A partial logo and fragments of text. The imaging team worked for hours, using various wavelengths of light and digital enhancement techniques to recover as much of the faded print as possible. Slowly, piece by piece, letters emerged from the ghostly impression. Recent Organic Farms, Frederick, Maryland, 301-555-. It was a fragment of a business flyer or receipt, the kind that small local businesses use for promotions or customer invoices. The forensic team immediately ran the partial business name through local databases. Within minutes, they had a match. Morrison Organic Farms, a small, family-run operation located on 15 acres of rural land approximately 8 miles outside Frederick city limits, just off Route 40. Property records showed the farm was owned by Douglas Allen Morrison, age 58, and his wife Evelyn Marie Morrison, age 56. The couple had purchased the property in May of 2012 for $285,000 in cash. No mortgage. They ran a modest organic farming operation, selling vegetables, herbs, and free-range chicken eggs at local farmers markets and through a small CSA subscription program. Detective Holloway immediately dispatched 2 investigators to conduct discreet interviews with neighbors and regular customers of Morrison Organic Farms. The picture that emerged was almost disturbing in its normalcy. Everyone described the Morrisons as quiet, polite, and intensely private. They were known to be deeply religious, often mentioning their faith in casual conversation. They kept to themselves, never threw parties, never had visitors, and never caused any problems. Several neighbors noted that they'd lived next to the Morrisons for years and had never once been inside their home. One farmer's market regular described them as nice enough, but there was always something a little off, like they were performing being normal rather than actually being normal. Detective Holloway pulled up the farm's address on Google Maps and then cross-referenced it with the location of Frederick Animal Care Clinic, where Rachel had collapsed. The distance between the 2 locations was 7.3 miles. A direct path would take someone along rural back roads with very little traffic. An exhausted, malnourished woman walking slowly could cover that distance in anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made Holloway's stomach turn. But it was the background check on Douglas and Evelyn Morrison that transformed this from a strong suspicion into a theory so disturbing that it made seasoned investigators feel physically ill. In August of 2010, 6 years before Rachel's disappearance, the Morrisons had suffered an unimaginable tragedy. Their only child, 19-year-old Emily Ann Morrison, had died in a hiking accident on the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania. According to the accident report filed by Pennsylvania State Police, Emily had been hiking alone on a challenging section near Hawk Mountain when she apparently lost her footing and fell from a cliff face. Her body was recovered 3 days later at the base of a 200-foot drop. The coroner ruled the death accidental. There was no evidence of foul play. After Emily's death, the Morrisons' lives had seemingly fallen apart. They sold their home in Pennsylvania. Douglas quit his job as an insurance adjuster. Evelyn left her position as an elementary school teacher. They moved to Maryland, purchased the farm, and disappeared into a life of near-total isolation, rarely seen in public except at farmers' markets where they sold their produce and interacted with customers only as much as was absolutely necessary to conduct business. A psychiatric expert consulted by the investigation reviewed Emily Morrison's case file and the timeline of events. His analysis, delivered in a grim conference call with the investigative team, noted several disturbing parallels that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Emily Morrison had been 19 years old when she died. Rachel Sullivan was 21 when she disappeared. Both were young women in the prime of their lives. Emily had been an avid hiker, known for taking solo trips on challenging trails. Rachel was also an experienced solo hiker conducting research on the Appalachian Trail. Both disappearances occurred on the Appalachian Trail in the fall season. Both involved falls from high elevations near water. And most chillingly, when the psychiatric expert compared photographs of Emily Morrison with early photos of Rachel Sullivan, he noted that while they weren't identical, there were significant similarities in their general appearance, build, hair color, and facial structure. "What you may be looking at," the psychiatrist explained, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was saying, "is a case of replacement. The Morrisons lost their daughter in a traumatic, sudden way. They never properly processed that grief. Instead of healing, they may have developed a shared delusional disorder, also known as folie à deux, where two people in a close relationship develop and reinforce the same psychotic beliefs. In this case, the delusion may have been that they could somehow bring Emily back or replace her by finding someone who fit her profile and forcing that person to become their daughter. The theory was horrifying, but it fit the evidence in a way that nothing else did. Surveillance was established on Morrison Organic Farms immediately. 2 undercover officers in an unmarked vehicle parked a quarter-mile away with a clear line of sight to the property. They documented everything: who came and went, what time lights went on and off, any vehicles that approached or left. For 3 days they watched and recorded. What they observed seemed frustratingly, suspiciously normal. Douglas Morrison left the property twice, once to drive into Frederick for supplies at a hardware store, and once to deliver produce to a farmer's market. Evelyn was visible occasionally through the windows of the greenhouse, tending to plants. The farm's one employee, a part-time helper who came twice a week to assist with heavy labor, arrived, worked his shift, and left without incident. Everything looked like a perfectly ordinary small farm operation. But investigators noticed something that didn't fit. There was a large barn on the property, old and weathered but clearly still in use. The barn's exterior showed signs of recent maintenance. New shingles on one section of roof, fresh paint on the doors. Yet during all 3 days of surveillance, the barn remained dark. Not once did anyone enter or exit. Not once did lights turn on inside. For a working farm, that was strange. Barns were typically the center of daily activity, used for storage, equipment maintenance, animal care. Even more suspicious, when investigators pulled utility records for the property, they discovered something that made no sense for a farm of that size. The Morrisons' electricity usage was dramatically higher than comparable properties in the area. Over the past 6 years, their average monthly electric bill was nearly 3 times what it should have been for a small farm with a modest house and a greenhouse. Something on that property was consuming a massive amount of power. But what? On March 12, 2022, exactly 4 days after Rachel's collapse at the veterinary clinic, Detective Holloway appeared before a judge with a thick binder of evidence. Rachel's testimony, the shopping list found in her pocket, the connection to Morrison Organic Farms, the suspicious background of the property owners, the disturbing parallels to Emily Morrison's death, surveillance reports, and utility records showing unexplained power consumption. The judge reviewed the evidence for less than 30 minutes before signing the search warrant. The grounds were listed as reasonable suspicion of kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, and potential evidence related to the disappearance and captivity of Rachel Sullivan. The warrant authorized a complete search of the Morrison property, including all buildings, vehicles, and grounds, with authorization to seize any and all evidence related to the case. The operation was scheduled for dawn the following morning. Every officer involved knew they were potentially about to uncover one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Maryland history. What none of them knew was just how right they would turn out to be. At exactly 5:47 a.m. on March 13, 2022, the silence of the rural Maryland countryside was shattered by the sound of multiple vehicles moving fast up the narrow gravel driveway leading to Morrison Organic Farms. The sky was just beginning to lighten with that pale gray pre-dawn glow that makes everything look ghostly and unreal. Tactical teams from Maryland State Police SWAT, FBI hostage rescue, and local law enforcement moved into position with practiced precision, surrounding the property and cutting off every possible escape route. The farmhouse door was breached at exactly 6 a.m. The battering ram hit the lock once, twice, and on the third impact the door exploded inward. Officers in full tactical gear poured into the house, shouting in that commanding voice trained specifically to overwhelm and disorient. "Police! Search warrant! Show us your hands! Get on the ground now!" They swept through the first floor in less than 90 seconds, clearing the living room, kitchen, dining area, and a small office. Then up the stairs, boots pounding on wood, weapons raised, adrenaline surging. Douglas and Evelyn Morrison were found in their second-floor bedroom, sitting upright on the edge of their bed, fully dressed despite the early hour, as if they'd been awake for some time, as if, perhaps, they'd been waiting. Evelyn Morrison's reaction was immediate and deeply bizarre. Instead of fear or confusion, her face showed something that looked almost like relief. She began crying, not with terror but with what seemed to be genuine emotion, and her first words to the armed officers surrounding her were, "Thank God you're here. Thank God. She ran away. Our girl ran away 3 days ago and we've been so worried. We didn't know what to do. You have to help us find her. She's not well. She needs her medication." The officers exchanged glances. They'd been briefed on the possibility of delusional behavior, but hearing it in person was still deeply unsettling. Douglas Morrison, by contrast, said absolutely nothing. He sat motionless on the bed, hands visible and empty, staring at the officers with eyes that showed no fear, no surprise, no emotion whatsoever. When ordered to stand and place his hands behind his back, he complied without a word, his face remaining completely blank as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He looked at his wife only once, a brief glance that Evelyn didn't return, and then he stared straight ahead at nothing, his expression never changing. While the Morrisons were escorted to separate patrol vehicles under the watch of armed officers, the real search of the property began. Detective Holloway, wearing protective gloves and carrying evidence bags, led a team of forensic specialists and investigators through the farmhouse methodically, room by room. The interior of the house was, at first glance, deeply disappointing in its complete normality. This was not the lair of obvious monsters. It was a typical home of a retired middle-class couple. The furniture was modest but well-maintained. The walls were painted in soft, neutral colors. The kitchen was clean, smelling faintly of coffee and the lemon-scented cleaner used on the countertops. Everything was organized, tidy, almost aggressively normal. Family photographs lined the walls of the hallway and living room, arranged in neat rows. Most showed a young girl at various ages, clearly Emily Morrison, growing from a chubby-faced toddler to a bright-eyed teenager. Emily at her high school graduation. Emily on a hiking trail with a backpack and walking stick. Emily smiling in front of a Christmas tree. The photos stopped abruptly at age 19, the age she died. But one of the investigators, a woman named Agent Sarah Chun with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, noticed something that made her stop and call others over. There were recent photographs mixed in with the older ones, pictures clearly taken within the past few years based on the digital quality and the Morrisons' aged appearance in them. These photos showed Evelyn Morrison posing in various locations around the farm, at the farmer's market stand, in the greenhouse. And in several of these recent photos, there was clearly someone else in the frame, someone standing next to Evelyn or slightly behind her. But that person's face had been deliberately obscured. In some photos, the face was blurred into an unrecognizable smudge. In others, it had been physically cut out of the printed photograph, leaving a person-shaped hole. In one particularly disturbing image, someone had carefully painted over the face with white correction fluid, leaving only a blank oval where a human face should have been. "They were erasing her," Agent Chun said quietly, photographing each altered picture with her camera, trying to erase Rachel and replace her completely with Emily. The barn was locked with a heavy-duty padlock, the kind used for high-security storage. Bolt cutters made quick work of it, and when the large sliding door was pulled open with a metallic shriek, the team was hit with a wave of stale air that had been trapped inside for who knows how long. The smell was distinctive and disturbing. A mixture of old hay and dust, yes, but underneath that, the unmistakable scent of industrial cleaning chemicals, chlorine bleach and ammonia, and something else beneath it all. The faint but definite smell of long-term human habitation in an enclosed space. Sweat, waste, fear. The main floor of the barn appeared, at first glance, to be used for legitimate farm purposes. There were stacks of hay bales along one wall, farming equipment that looked old but functional, bags of animal feed and fertilizer, coils of rope, empty crates. Everything you would expect to find in a working barn. But Detective Holloway, who had grown up on a farm and knew what a working barn should look and feel like, immediately noticed that something was off. The floor in the center of the barn looked wrong. The wooden planks were newer than the rest of the structure, less weathered, a slightly different color. And there were faint marks in the dust and dirt, drag marks, as if something heavy had been moved repeatedly across the same path, wearing away the grime in a subtle but visible pattern. Those marks led to a section of floor near the back wall, an area that looked completely unremarkable except for those barely visible traces of regular disturbance. One of the officers knelt down and knocked on the wooden planks with his knuckles. The sound that came back was wrong. Instead of the solid thud you'd expect from floorboards laid directly on ground or a foundation, there was a hollow echo. Empty space beneath. "There's something under here," the officer said, and within minutes the entire team was focused on that section of floor, examining it inch by inch. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful searching before they found the mechanism. A section of 3 floor planks that looked identical to all the others, but which were actually attached to a concealed hinge system. When the hidden latch was released, the entire section lifted upward on counterweight hinges that were engineered so precisely that even with the weight of thick wooden planks, the door could be opened with one hand. Beneath the false floor was a narrow wooden staircase descending steeply into complete darkness. The stairs looked old, the wood worn smooth from repeated use. There was no light below, just a black rectangle that seemed to swallow the beams from the officers' flashlights. Detective Holloway drew his weapon and clicked on the tactical flashlight mounted beneath the barrel. "Frederick Police. If anyone is down there, make yourself known." His voice echoed down the stairs and disappeared into darkness with no response. 3 officers descended slowly, weapons drawn, flashlights sweeping back and forth, calling out warnings and commands. Their boots on the wooden stairs created a hollow, ominous sound. At the bottom, perhaps 12 feet below the barn floor, their lights revealed what would later be described in official reports, affidavits, and court testimony as one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Maryland state history. The underground room had been carved out beneath the barn's foundation, a space roughly 15 feet wide by 20 feet long with concrete walls and a low ceiling barely 6.5 feet high. The air was thick, damp, and stale despite a narrow PVC pipe that ran up through the barn floor to the outside, providing barely adequate ventilation. The concrete walls showed signs of moisture damage, with patches of black mold growing in the corners. The floor was bare concrete, stained and discolored from years of use. In the far corner, sitting on a rough wooden pallet, was a thin mattress covered with sheets that had once been white but were now a dingy gray. The sheets were threadbare, worn nearly transparent in places. Next to the mattress was a plastic bucket with a lid, the kind used for storing animal feed. The bucket served an obvious and degrading purpose. Next to it were several plastic gallon jugs of water, some empty, some still partially full. But it was the walls that made even veteran officers stop and stare. Attached to the concrete at regular intervals, at exactly eye level for someone sitting on that mattress, were sheets of laminated paper. The lamination was yellowed with age, suggesting these had been there for years. Each sheet contained hand-printed rules in large, clear letters. Speak only when spoken to. All tasks must be completed before rest. Gratitude is mandatory for all privileges. The past is forbidden. Only today exists. Obedience ensures safety for those you love. The last rule, the one about loved ones, was particularly chilling given what investigators now knew about how the Morrisons had controlled Rachel. They hadn't just imprisoned her body. They'd imprisoned her through threats against her family. Embedded directly into the concrete floor, approximately 4 feet from the mattress, was a heavy metal ring, the kind used for securing large animals or heavy equipment. Attached to it was a thick chain, each link nearly half an inch thick, coated with rust in places but still clearly functional. The chain was approximately 12 feet long, and at the end was a locking metal cuff lined with what looked like strips of old leather or cloth, presumably to prevent the metal from cutting too deeply into skin during long-term wear. Forensic technicians measured the chain carefully. Its length was calculated with disturbing precision. 12 feet was enough to allow the prisoner to reach the bucket in the corner, to lie down on the mattress, to stand and move around most of the room. But it was not quite long enough to reach the stairs. The prisoner could see the way out, could see daylight when the floor above was opened, but could never reach it. It was psychological torture built into the architecture itself. The forensic team began documenting everything, photographing from every angle, taking samples, measuring distances. They found Rachel Sullivan's DNA everywhere. On the mattress, on the chain, on the walls where she'd apparently leaned or touched. They found years of accumulated evidence of human habitation. Fingerprints worn into the concrete where she'd apparently pressed her hands thousands of times, possibly in prayer or desperation. In one corner, they found a small stack of children's books, simple picture books and early readers, the kind you'd give to a young child. The pages were worn soft from repeated handling, some corners torn, some pages marked with what looked like makeshift bookmarks. These had apparently been the only entertainment, the only escape from reality, that Rachel had been allowed during her captivity. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, barely visible even with flashlights, one of the forensic technicians noticed marks scratched into the concrete wall. She called others over and they shined their lights directly on it. Someone, using what must have been a nail or a piece of metal or perhaps even a shard of rock, had carved words into the concrete with painstaking effort. The letters were crude and uneven, carved over what must have been many, many hours of desperate work. Rachel Sullivan. I was here. I am real. September 14th, 2016. I am not Emily. I am Rachel. She had been trying to hold onto herself. In a place designed to erase her identity completely, she had carved her name into the wall, a desperate message to herself, to the future, to anyone who might eventually find this place. A message that said, I existed. I was a person. I had a name and a life and they tried to take it away, but I will not let them erase me completely. Several of the officers had to step outside after seeing that. Even hardened investigators who'd seen terrible things in their careers found themselves fighting back tears. The full story of what happened to Rachel Sullivan emerged slowly over the following weeks, pieced together from multiple sources. Digital forensics conducted on the Morrisons' computers and phones, surveillance footage recovered from gas stations and trail cameras, physical evidence collected from the underground cell, and eventually, from a detailed confession given by Evelyn Morrison in exchange for a plea deal with prosecutors. What investigators discovered was that the Morrisons had not gone to the Appalachian Trail on September 14, 2016, as innocent tourists or even as grieving parents seeking solace in nature. They had gone there to hunt, and they had been hunting for months. Digital forensics specialists recovered deleted files from Douglas Morrison's laptop computer, files that had been permanently erased but which left recoverable traces on the hard drive. Among these recovered files was a folder created in April of 2016, 5 full months before Rachel's disappearance. The folder was innocuously labeled Farm Equipment Research, but its contents were anything but innocent. Inside were dozens of photographs taken at various Appalachian Trail parking areas and trailheads throughout Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The photos were candid shots of hikers, specifically young women hiking alone. Each photo was labeled with metadata: date, location, approximate age of the subject, and brief notes. Too old 30s? Read one. Wrong build, too heavy, read another. With boyfriend unsuitable, read a third. They had been systematically surveilling the trail system, watching, evaluating, looking for someone who met very specific criteria. Someone young. Someone who physically resembled their dead daughter, Emily. Someone hiking alone, vulnerable, with no immediate backup or witnesses. Someone whose disappearance might plausibly be attributed to the many natural dangers of wilderness hiking. Bank and credit card statements pulled by investigators revealed a disturbing pattern of purchases made throughout the summer of 2016. In June, Douglas had purchased a large bottle of liquid chloroform from a chemical supply company, ostensibly for farm pest control, though investigators would later determine there was no legitimate agricultural use for that specific chemical in the quantity purchased. In July, they'd bought a high-powered stun gun from an online retailer, the kind used for personal protection but which could easily incapacitate someone with a single discharge. Then, on August 30th, just 2 weeks before Rachel's disappearance, a particularly damning piece of evidence emerged. A detective reviewing traffic camera footage from a gas station in the small town of Cook City, Maryland, located about 40 miles from Harper's Ferry, noticed something significant. The footage showed the Morrisons' dark blue minivan, easily identified by its license plate, parked at the edge of the gas station lot at 9:47 on the morning of August 30th. For nearly 90 minutes, the van remained parked in that spot while Douglas and Evelyn sat inside, apparently watching the flow of tourists and hikers coming and going. Then, at 11:23 a.m., a silver Honda Civic pulled into the station. A young woman got out, filled her gas tank, and went inside to pay. She wore hiking clothes and carried herself with the confident posture of an experienced outdoors person. The security camera captured Evelyn Morrison exiting the minivan and walking slowly past the silver Honda, appearing to look casually at her phone but actually, as the footage clearly showed, leaning slightly to peer through the car's windows, checking whether anyone else was inside, examining the hiking gear visible in the back seat. She then walked past the woman as she exited the gas station, getting close enough to assess her height, build, and general appearance. Evelyn returned to the minivan, appeared to speak briefly with Douglas, and then, crucially, as the silver Honda pulled out of the gas station and headed west on Route 340 toward Harper's Ferry, the Morrisons' van followed. Forensic specialists enhanced the gas station footage and managed to capture a partial view of the Honda's license plate. It matched Rachel Sullivan's vehicle. The Morrisons had been stalking Rachel for at least 2 weeks before they took her. They'd followed her, learned her patterns, identified her as their target. They knew she hiked alone. They knew she went to remote sections of trail. They knew she would be vulnerable. Under the pressure of overwhelming evidence, facing multiple life sentences, Evelyn Morrison's defense attorney negotiated a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for her full cooperation and truthful testimony about every detail of the crime, including her husband's role and the specifics of what they'd done to Rachel over 6 years, the prosecution would take the death penalty off the table and recommend a sentence that would at least theoretically allow for the possibility of parole after several decades. Evelyn accepted the deal, and in a series of recorded interviews conducted over 5 days in March of 2022, she provided a chilling, methodical account of how they had abducted and imprisoned Rachel Sullivan. On the morning of September 14, 2016, the Morrisons had driven to the Loudon Heights trailhead, arriving before dawn. They knew from their surveillance that Rachel often started her hikes early to catch morning light for photography. They parked their van on an unmarked old logging road about half a mile from the main trail, a location scouted weeks earlier specifically because it was hidden from view but provided quick access to the trail system. Then they waited. According to Evelyn's statement, they had brought a thermos of coffee, some granola bars, and binoculars. They were prepared to wait all day if necessary. But at 7:32 a.m., they saw Rachel's silver Honda pull into the main parking area. They watched through binoculars as she prepared her gear, checked her equipment, and headed up the trail. Douglas said it was perfect. Evelyn told investigators, her voice flat and emotionless in the recording. He said the conditions were perfect. Weekday morning, not many other hikers. Weather clear but not too hot. She was wearing bright colors which made her easy to track from a distance. Douglas, who had extensive experience in hunting and wilderness tracking from his youth, followed Rachel up the trail while staying far enough back to avoid being seen or heard. Evelyn had taken a different, faster route, cutting through the woods on a path Douglas had mapped out during their pre-planning. The goal was for Evelyn to position herself ahead of Rachel at a predetermined location, a relatively isolated section of trail about 1.5 miles from the parking area. When Rachel came around a bend in the trail, she encountered what appeared to be a hiker in distress. Evelyn Morrison was sitting on the ground next to the trail, one leg extended awkwardly, her face contorted in apparent pain. Next to her was a small daypack and a hiking pole that she'd apparently dropped. "Help!" Evelyn called out when she saw Rachel approaching. "Please, I think I twisted my ankle really badly. I can't put any weight on it." According to Evelyn's confession, Rachel did exactly what any decent human being would do. She immediately stopped, set down her camera equipment, and hurried over to help. "Is it swollen?" Rachel asked, kneeling down to examine Evelyn's supposedly injured ankle. "Do you have ice packs? Should I call for help?" "I don't have signal," Evelyn said, which was true. That section of trail had poor cell reception, another factor the Morrisons had specifically selected for. "Can you help me stand? I need to see if I can put pressure on it." Rachel positioned herself next to Evelyn, putting one arm around the older woman's back to help support her weight as she stood. "Okay, on 3, Rachel said. 1, 2. She never got to 3. Douglas Morrison, who had been concealed behind a large outcropping of rocks just off the trail, stepped out silently behind Rachel. In his hand was the high-voltage stun gun. He pressed it against the base of Rachel's neck and pulled the trigger. The electrical discharge, 50,000 volts delivered directly to the nervous system, caused instantaneous incapacitation. Rachel's entire body went rigid, her muscles seizing involuntarily, and then she collapsed, completely unconscious before she even hit the ground. The entire attack had taken less than 5 seconds. There had been no time to scream, no time to fight, barely even time to realize what was happening. "Douglas caught her as she fell," Evelyn stated in her confession. "We didn't want her to hit her head on the rocks and cause visible injury. We needed her intact." Douglas immediately pulled out the chloroform and a cloth, holding it over Rachel's nose and mouth to ensure she remained unconscious while they moved her. Then, working quickly, they carried Rachel's limp body off the trail and through approximately 200 yards of dense forest to where their van was hidden. The entire process, from the moment Douglas triggered the stun gun to the moment they had Rachel secured in the back of their van, took less than 10 minutes. But before they left, they executed the final, crucial part of their plan. Douglas returned to the area where they'd taken Rachel and carefully removed any signs of struggle, smoothing out disturbed soil, repositioning fallen leaves and small branches. Then he took one of Rachel's hiking boots, which they'd removed while she was unconscious, carried it approximately a quarter mile to a point where the trail ran close to the cliff edge overlooking the Potomac River gorge, and threw it as hard as he could toward the water below. The boot was discovered 4 days later, wedged between rocks near the river, exactly as Douglas had intended. Everyone assumed Rachel had fallen from the cliff. No one looked for an abduction because the physical evidence suggested a tragic accident. Rachel regained consciousness in the underground room beneath the barn, chained to the floor, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. According to Evelyn's account, Rachel screamed for hours that first day, pulling frantically at the chain until her wrists bled, begging to be released, demanding to know why this was happening. The Morrisons' answer, delivered calmly by Evelyn while Douglas stood silent and watching, was simple. "You're Emily now. Your old life is over. The person you used to be drowned in the river." Everyone believes you're dead. No one is looking for you. This is your reality now. For the first weeks, Rachel fought constantly. She refused to eat, refused to acknowledge them, spent every moment either screaming for help that would never come or searching desperately for some weakness in the chain, some flaw in the concrete, some way to escape. But the room had been designed specifically to be escape-proof. The chain was rated to hold several thousand pounds. The concrete walls were reinforced. The soundproofing was so effective that someone could scream at the top of their lungs and not be heard 10 feet away. When physical resistance proved futile, Rachel tried to maintain her psychological identity. She would recite her own biographical details to herself like a mantra. My name is Rachel Elizabeth Sullivan. I was born on June 3, 1995. My parents are Thomas and Margaret Sullivan. I'm a graduate student at Northeastern University. I study environmental science. I am real. I existed. I am not Emily Morrison. But the Morrisons had prepared for this too. Their method of breaking Rachel's will was not based on physical torture, though there were certainly elements of physical punishment. It was based on something more insidious. Psychological manipulation combined with threats against the people Rachel loved most. Douglas had taken photographs of Rachel's parents' home in Boston. He had images of her father leaving for work, her mother grocery shopping, her younger sister walking her dog. He showed these photos to Rachel regularly, calmly explaining that he had people watching her family. That if Rachel tried to escape, if she tried to signal for help, if she did anything other than complete obedience, he would know immediately. And her family would pay the price. I told her we had people in Boston. Evelyn confessed to investigators. I told her we had video cameras watching her parents' house 24 hours a day. I told her we had friends who could get to her family within minutes if we gave the word. None of it was true. We didn't have anyone in Boston. We didn't have cameras. But she believed us. She was so terrified of something happening to her family that she stopped fighting. The psychological torture was compounded by sensory deprivation and disorientation. Rachel was kept in darkness most of the time, with light only during task periods when she was required to perform chores. She had no way to tell what time it was, what day it was, or how long she'd been imprisoned. Time became meaningless, which made psychological resistance even harder. The Morrisons' goal, explicitly stated in digital notes found on Douglas's computer, was what they called identity reconstruction. They wanted to erase Rachel Sullivan completely and replace her with a version of Emily Morrison who would be grateful for their rescue, obedient to their commands, and psychologically dependent on them for her sense of self and purpose. After the first year, they began allowing Rachel out of the underground room for brief periods, always under close supervision, always in the dark hours before dawn when neighbors wouldn't see. She was forced to do farm work, cleaning animal pens, hauling feed, maintaining equipment. It was physically exhausting labor designed to keep her too tired to think about escape. We were training her, Evelyn said in her confession, using language that made prosecutors physically ill, teaching her that obedience led to small privileges. Resistance led to isolation and darkness. It's basic behavioral psychology. By the third year, according to Evelyn, Rachel had stopped using her real name entirely, at least out loud. She had learned that referring to herself as Rachel led to punishment, days of isolation with reduced food and water. Referring to herself as Emily, or better yet, not using any name at all and simply accepting the role of obedient daughter, led to slightly less harsh treatment. The psychological concept is called learned helplessness, and it's one of the most effective tools for controlling captives over long periods. When someone learns through repeated experience that resistance is futile and only brings more suffering, while compliance brings slightly less suffering, they eventually stop resisting entirely. Not because they accept their situation, but because they no longer believe escape is possible. The day Rachel collapsed at the veterinary clinic in March of 2022 was not the result of a conscious decision to escape or seek help. It was, as investigators came to understand, a purely physical breakdown that occurred despite Rachel's psychological conditioning. Evelyn had developed a severe respiratory infection and was running a high fever. Douglas was at a farm equipment auction nearly 2 hours away, a trip he'd planned weeks in advance. They needed specific medications and cleaning supplies urgently. For the first time in 6 years, they faced a choice. Risk sending Rachel out alone, or let Evelyn's condition potentially worsen to the point of needing hospitalization, which would bring unwanted attention from medical professionals. They chose to take the risk. By that point, they believed Rachel was completely broken, completely controlled. They believed she would follow instructions, complete the task, and return without attempting to escape or speak to anyone beyond what was necessary to make purchases. And they were almost right. According to the veterinary clinic staff's testimony, Rachel hadn't asked for help. She hadn't tried to explain her situation. She'd asked only for a phone, presumably to call the Morrisons and report that she'd completed the task. She collapsed not because she was trying to escape, but because her body, after 6 years of malnutrition, chronic stress, and living in survival mode, simply could not sustain the physical exertion required to walk over 7 miles and complete a shopping trip. Her biological systems shut down. And in that moment of physical failure, her captor's perfect psychological control was finally broken by simple human physiology. Douglas and Evelyn Morrison were arrested and transported to Maryland State Police Barracks for interrogation in separate rooms to prevent coordinating stories. Evelyn broke first. Faced with overwhelming evidence from the underground cell, surveillance footage, and forensic proof, her delusion began cracking. She insisted through tears they had saved Rachel, that the girl had been lost and needed a family, that they'd given her purpose and love. "We gave her everything Emily had," Evelyn said, voice rising. "A home, family. We treated her like our own daughter. The world is dangerous. We protected her." The prosecutor would later describe this as textbook shared delusional disorder, where two isolated people develop and reinforce the same false beliefs. In the Morrisons' twisted reality, they genuinely believed they were rescuing Rachel. Douglas never showed remorse. During interrogation, he sat silent for hours, refusing to answer. When he finally spoke, his words were cold. "She was better off with us. She had no purpose out there. We gave her one." Asked if he felt guilt, Douglas stared at the detective and said, "You don't feel guilty for saving a drowning person. You feel proud." The trial began in October 2022, lasting 6 weeks. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, medical testimony, expert witnesses on captivity psychology. They showed photographs of Rachel's injuries, the scars, chemical burns, restraint marks. The most powerful moment came when Rachel took the stand. She walked slowly to the witness box, hands clasped, eyes down. Even months later, she moved like someone expecting punishment. When asked to identify her captors, she looked up at Douglas and Evelyn. "They told me I was dead," Rachel said quietly but steadily. "They told me everyone I loved believed I was gone, and if I ever tried to leave, they would make it true. They told me I was Emily now, and Rachel Sullivan had drowned in the river. For a long time, I believed them." She described years in captivity without emotion, as if recounting someone else's story, a dissociative technique common in trauma survivors. She described the chain, tasks, rules, being sent out in darkness for farm work, always supervised, always terrified. When the defense attorney suggested she'd accepted her situation and could have left earlier, Rachel's answer stopped him. "I couldn't leave, not because I didn't want to, but because they convinced me my freedom would cost my family their lives." When you're told that every day for 6 years, shown pictures of your parents' house, told one wrong move makes you responsible for their deaths, you stop thinking about freedom. You only think about keeping them safe. The defense argued diminished capacity, that grief had driven the Morrisons into delusion. But prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation. Months of planning, cell construction, deliberate victim targeting. This wasn't spontaneous grief. It was calculated and sustained over 6 years. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Douglas Morrison, guilty on all counts, sentenced to life without parole. The judge said, "You didn't save Rachel Sullivan. You stole her life, her identity. 6 years she'll never recover. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars, which is more freedom than you ever gave her." Evelyn Morrison, who cooperated with investigators and showed limited remorse, received 40 years with parole possible after 30. For Rachel's family, it felt like betrayal. The woman who designed daily torments would potentially walk free someday. But the prosecutor explained, without Evelyn's testimony, some details might never have been known. Imperfect justice, but justice nonetheless. The trial's end didn't mean Rachel's nightmare was over. She returned to her parents' Boston home, to the bedroom preserved exactly as she'd left it. But Rachel wasn't the same person who'd packed that hiking backpack in September 2016. That confident 21-year-old graduate student was gone. She couldn't sleep in her bedroom because being alone in a closed room triggered panic attacks. She slept on the living room couch with lights on, needing to see exits, needing to know she wasn't trapped. She flinched at sudden movements. She asked permission before eating, before using the bathroom, before speaking. Her therapist explained these were conditioned responses from years of controlled existence. Intellectually, Rachel knew she was free, but her nervous system hadn't caught up. What helped was connecting with other survivors through a trauma support network. They understood the guilt of survival, the shame of compliance, the confusion of missing captivity simply because it was familiar. Rachel also found purpose in advocacy, speaking to law enforcement about recognizing signs of long-term captivity, working with organizations supporting families of missing persons. 3 years after her rescue, Rachel returned to the Appalachian Trail, not to Loudon Heights where she'd been taken, but to a different section in Vermont, accompanied by her sister and a therapy dog. She hiked 2 miles slowly, stopping frequently, sometimes just sitting and breathing. When asked why she'd returned to the place that was the setting of her nightmare, Rachel's answer was simple. The trail didn't hurt me, people did. And I refused to let them take the mountains from me too. Douglas Morrison died in prison in 2024 from a heart attack. He never expressed remorse. Evelyn remains incarcerated, her earliest parole hearing scheduled for 2052. The underground room beneath Morrison Organic Farms was filled with concrete and sealed. The property was sold and turned into a community garden, a place of growth instead of captivity. Rachel Sullivan is still here, still fighting, still remembering that she is real. Thanks for watching until the end. It really means a lot. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what stood out to you most. And of course, make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. See you soon.